We are in the third weekend of this series, and it was interesting hearing some of you that came up and provided an offering of sorts of kind of where you are, more or less in life. And it's interesting, if I were to say, how do you think you got to where you are now after X number of years? You might give a variety of answers, right? You might have a reason for it, or maybe, you might use language like, well, everything has a purpose, or there's always a reason for something, or, it was God's will, or I believe the Bible enough, or I prayed enough, or maybe you just don't know. And part of what I want to talk about is the how behind you become more liberated, or you become a person who's working through an evolutionary process. Those are the first two progressive planes we've talked about over the last couple of weekends. Liberated people help liberate people. Free people, free people. And we have to begin to look at our lives through the lens of a more evolutionary process, the way that we understand God, the way we understand becoming someone different. The progressive plane that I want to talk about this morning has something to do with awareness and how we become more aware. If you grew up in Sunday school, you probably remember the story of a prophet named Elijah. He's a prophet from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, prophets were sort of these quirky, sort of mouthpieces of God. And they showed up in the history and the story of Israel sometimes to celebrate the way Israel's really getting it right with God. And then often they were the ones pointing to all the ways that they were getting it wrong. And so they weren't always welcome. Sometimes they were really heralded. They were beloved, especially when things were good. But when things weren't so good, they were often speaking into power structures and creating conflict for leadership within the culture in the kingdom of Israel. And so Elijah is one of Israel's most beloved prophets until he starts to confront this kingdom dynasty that was emergence. It was emerged between a queen by the name of Jezebel and a king by the name of Ahab. Jezebel was a Phoenician queen, and she had prophets of Baal and a whole following. And then Ahab was an Israeli king. He was a Jewish king. And it was a really bad idea for them to merge their kingdoms. And everybody kind of knew it, but they just sort of didn't care. And Elijah, who's a prophet, starts to confront them because of the way they are organizing themselves is creating toxicity in the nation of Israel, and it's causing people to suffer, and it just escalates. It starts to escalate. And the next thing you know, and I'm giving a lot of history here in just a few moments, but 150 prophets of Baal are slaughtered. And Jezebel freaks out. She puts a contract out on Elijah's life. He, all of a sudden, instead of being the beloved prophet, he's on the run. And he finds himself hiding in a cave. Everything has sort of changed for him. Who he thought he was, the things he could count on, the ways that he could depend on God, all of that got rearranged. There was total chaos, disorder. And we find Elijah in a cave lamenting, describing his life as worthless, wondering why God didn't kill him in the first place, or maybe he should just go ahead and take his own life. And it says that these angelic beings show up and they begin to care for him and nurture him and provide him rest. But there comes this moment when he's invited to step into this cave, the opening of this cave, and to hear or to see a particular thing. He's lamenting, he's struggling, and these angelic beings, they step to the front of the cave, and it says, then all of a sudden, the earth shook, and rocks fell. And God wasn't in the earth shaking. He wasn't in the rocks falling. It says there was a great wind, there was a great fire, but God wasn't in the wind, he wasn't in the fire. And then after the earthquaking, after the fire, after the wind, it says there was a whisper. And after this whisper, he's still standing in the front of the cave, and he's just sort of pontificating, what should I do? Literally, God says, why are you still standing there? And he says, go back the way you came to the desert of Damascus. Go back to the way that you came into the desert of Damascus. And so he leaves that situation, and he goes back into a place of activation and purpose. And he does specific things. He names prophets. He names kings. He does something that he didn't have the mind to do or the activation to do, and he lives differently. And it says in the closing scene of this story, yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him. In other words, you thought you were alone in this, but there's a whole group of people that are standing with you and saying, yes, we're together. Completely rearranged idea of what he thought he was living with. And what this story underscores, and if I could get you to transcend a literal understanding of this text, because you can get caught up in, did the earth really quake, and did the wind really blow? Did this really happen? There's actually something to see along the lines of how we move from being one place in life to the next. And so, for instance, the very first stage of change for Elijah is everything got turned upside down. Everything changed for him. Who he thought he was and what he could depend on no longer existed. He was the beloved, now he's the goat. And then the next stage he steps into is this cave stage. He goes into this darkest place in himself, and he's lamenting, he's wondering, he's suffering. Should I even be alive? This feels like I'm dying. And it says then there's this earthquake, and there's wind, and there's fire. There's not necessarily the sort of earth, wind, and fire we had in the 70s. Or, maybe not this. The earthquakes, the wind blows, and there's fire. In some theological mindsets, this is the strength of God, but then another way to interpret this is devastation, this is suffering, this is a death process. And after the death process, as he's allowed this to take place, he hears something different. There's a whisper. Go allow yourself to be a part of something completely different than what you've been doing throughout this history of your life and this history as a prophet. And he goes into a new place in the world. He goes back into the wilderness. He puts his backpack on, his staff, and off he goes. And so the reason I'm sharing this is because there's a particular process that we see unfolding here. By the way, it says that he goes back into the wilderness to a place called Damascus. What other biblical figure has a transformative experience on the way to Damascus? Does anybody remember this story? Paul, right? And it's interesting because Paul has a similar journey. He's this persecutor of Christians. He has this confrontational experience with Christ. He's completely brought to the end of himself. There's scales that are covering his eyes. He finds himself in the care and the support and the nurturing of someone, the last person he thought he would be finding that sort of sustenance in. And then the scales fall off and he lives a different world. And both of these stories underscore a process of change that involves awareness. There's great change in a person's life, which leads to suffering and death, which then leads to some sense of awareness or epiphany, then maturity, and then new life. Change, suffering and death, awareness, epiphany, maturity, new life. So let me say a couple things about awareness and progress. All right? Awareness, having a new idea or thinking different, isn't really transformation. Information doesn't equal transformation. Information that activates you in a different direction so that you decide, I'm going to be someone different, I'm going to change my behavior. That's transformation. Awareness is just seeing something different in a new way, different than the way that I've seen it in the past. In fact, that's awareness. And then progress is when that awareness wakes you up in such a way that no matter what you've been doing, no matter the way that you've been seeing the world or activating yourself, you just can't live that way anymore. You have to live different. So every single one of you in your past have had some sort of circumstance or situation. Every single one of you have had a season where you've gone through enormous change. Right? I don't care what your theological positions have been or what your religious or spiritual perspectives have included. We've all changed at some level. And so here's what I want to invite you to do for a moment. I want you to reflect on this process for yourself in your own life. If you had to move back in your past, is there a season or a situation where you can identify these stages of progress for yourself? Could you give language to it? And what I would be interested to hear is, is there an observation? Is there a question that you could share? I want to take in just a few moments, I want to invite, I'm going to have, not now, but in just a few moments, I'm going to have a couple of guys come up and take these mics. And I would love to hear, when you think about your life and some of the changes that have taken place, what comes to mind in some of these stages and some of the way this has progressed forward? What observations could you make while you're thinking through that? And maybe you might even want to pull out your memos app on your phone and maybe jot some things down as you're thinking through this. But what I would be interested in hearing is creating a moment here where you share something with the room and we learn something together from each other. One of the ways that I would give language to this for me, if I were to share my story, there's a lot of things I think I could speak into on this, but probably about 4 or 5 years ago, in my experience of deconstruction and reconstruction, when things started to shift, the cave that I entered into had something to do with the relational disconnect that I was anticipating. When the needle started to move for me in understanding God differently, understanding the scriptures differently, understanding humanity differently, I started to be concerned, who is going to reject me and my family? Is that going to create some sort of problem within Watershed and our culture? What types of organizations and communities that I've been a part of in the past are going to push me aside and discredit me or make it difficult for me or just ignore me. Like, I can't be in relationship with you. Those were real feelings for me 4, 5, 6 years ago. And so I'm kind of in this cave place. And one of the ideas that surfaced for me was how so much of what I've always believed had something to do with the way I'd been socially conditioned. And that's not necessarily a new idea for you or for me, right? Like, we all know that there are ways of understanding ourselves in the world that we've just been validated towards, if we're American or if we're male, if we're female, if we're white, if we're black, if we're gay, if we're straight. Like, we get conditioned whether we realize it or not. I could live with that. What was a real hard thing to hear was that was true in my religious community too. Like, there was a reason that I held certain beliefs about certain things, because it was to my advantage as I was accepted in that in-group to make sure that I toed the line in those particular areas. So it sent me on this journey of going, well, like, what are some of the things that I've just sort of swallowed and not really paid much attention to, and what are the expenses? What could I be aware of in that? And so I'm just going to talk about just a couple. If I could have an umbrella of grace to even process some of this, I'm still working through some of these things. But one of the things in my previous religious environment, one of the things that was so pounded into me was masculinity is about leadership. Masculinity is about men taking charge. And if you're going to be a strong husband, a strong pastor, a strong man, like, you got to step up. You got to take control of whatever it is that you're a part of, which isn't necessarily a bad idea, but I would argue that's not just a something for men. That's like, if you're in an environment where, I don't care who you are, you possess the gift of leadership, well, then just step up, right? That shouldn't be just for one type of person. But what we never talked about in that environment was masculinity as vulnerability. It's like actually owning some of your weaknesses. And we never talked about making room for other voices, other dispositions, stepping aside and letting others move in front of you, even if that other person was female. And so part of what has been a really transformative experience for me here is having my sisterhood here at Watershed name this for me in real time, during staff meetings, during social gatherings, during moments where we're sharing with one another. The idea that somehow I've been swimming in patriarchy and never even realized it. Another thing that I think surfaced for me in this is the idea of morality as binary. In my previous religious experience, everything was either right or wrong. It was either good or it was evil. It was absolutely true or absolutely false. And so Taryn mentioned our LGBTQ community here. There was a time when Watershed wasn't inclusive. It wasn't fully affirming, fully accepting. And part of the reason we were trapped in that way of thinking was it could only be one thing or another. There was no space for morality to be nuanced by the complexity and the essence of an evolving humanity. And so when we started to sit with that idea, and we started to, dare I say, be given a seat with the LGBT community here, and to hear the pain that had gone on in their life, things started to surface. There was an awareness that it allowed us to embody a different way of being, and that was impactful for myself and impactful for this community. I know there's a third thing on the screen that we don't have time for this morning, but I've been doing a lot of talking for the last few minutes. Can I invite you now? You've had a few moments to kind of think about this. Like, when you think about the change that you've gone through, what sort of observations could you make? What sort of questions could you offer in this morning? And could we create just a brief moment of question, response, dialogue? I would love to hear from you how your wheels are spinning right now in terms of awareness that leads to some sort of behavioral or new change in your life, and how that's looked over the past, or any other observations or questions you might have.
Having found myself in these life cycles, or cycles of change, if you will, I've noticed in my own personal life at the sort of suffering stage that when I've come out of that, there's a bit of the ego, the self, that has to die, metaphorically, right? But I have noticed that happen in a couple of iterations, either when I have suffered with depression, also another time when I lost my job and I was sort of forced into one of these cycles. It took a lot of casting aside of my own ideas of what success looked like or what healthy looked like. And so I have just a pattern I've noticed that suffering and death sometimes also includes death of the ego.
Yeah, you wonder if that's really the whole deal in and of itself, right? The idea that I attach so deeply, my me-ness is so entrenched in a particular way of thinking. And when that gets upended, did it feel like like your identity was dying through that process?
So when I think about my mental depression, which was a pretty rock bottom place, part of my identity was sort of shifting, but I think of it as maybe molting. It was a good thing. And part of it, I think, is that I just lacked the imagination to see a better self or a better future. So I was teaching. I was a high school English teacher. It felt missional. It felt transformational. I was in a high poverty school. So to get laid off was like I don't understand. This is good work. Why, right? But I don't think I had the imagination that God does for my life about what next chapters could look like. So I think in that instance, it was sort of a reimagining. And so in that sense, it was good, a deepening of my identity, not necessarily a total shift of my identity.
Interesting. Thanks.
I don't know if this is exactly what you're looking for, but one of the things for me is sometimes you're changing from one positive thing to an even bigger positive thing. And that requires a suffering and a death just to let go of even a really good chapter. Yeah. So I have learned recently a lot about just that anxiety and excitement and how to hold those things in balance to walk away from even something very good for something else. So I do think what you're saying about not being static and not letting that even really be an option is relevant. It doesn't always have to, in my experience, be something catastrophically bad.
Well said. I think sometimes it's the thing that happens to us, but then it's the thing that we create. My family and I recently sold our house and bought this other house and started to renovate it. And it was a good thing. It was like this was an idea that we all said, yeah, this would be a good thing, until we started doing it. And then we realized, man, this is a really hard thing. And all that just the change from the one good thing to the next good thing, there was an upheaval. Our whole family went through, and it felt like there was something that was dying along the way in order to get to this new thing that we were doing. And that was just a house. Like in one level, it feels that almost feels trite, but it underscores the process that you just described. I think anytime you say yes to change, like whether that's something you say, like you do yourself, or it happens to you, this sort of process, it's possible, will start to surface. Who else?
My name's Mike. Yeah, I think for me that the change was probably over the last 6 months to a year. This sense that there's more than just going to church and, like you said, having that awareness, and that ultimately information does not equal that transformation, and realizing of those things that you've lived in, whether it's patriarchy, you just didn't realize, and that being a part of that, I do have a voice, and I can use my voice to speak up for others who may not have a voice or whose voice has been suppressed.
Well said. In weekends down the road, some of the other progressive planes are it's almost like you're getting these first 3 or 4 sort of foundational planes that we're standing on, and then we have to start talking about some things that I think I hear you saying, things like solidarity and justice. Like, how do we occupy those spaces with a progressive view of what it means to be a follower of Christ, a lover of the divine, a lover of God, things of that nature. Yes, please.
I think that with the suffering thing, it's just funny that I've noticed that the more that I have used my voice, I don't know if I had to call it suffering, but it is interesting to see the pushback that you get from people that still do live in those things. And it's almost, I don't know, for me, it's like an internal suffering in that, how did they not see it? How did I come to see it? How do I help them see it? So it's just this, I don't know. I don't know how to put words to that. I wouldn't call it suffering, because I think that in regards to other people that really are suffering is.
Sure, I understand. One of the things, and we talk about this in preface pretty extensively for the record, is as you become aware of something new, if that doesn't create more humility, more patience with people who maybe haven't gone through the same experiences as you, if you're not careful, then going through this creates a new kind of legalism. Do you see what I'm saying? All of a sudden, oh, look how evolved we are. Look how liberated we are. And I think that's, if that ends up becoming the end game for what it means to be liberated and to evolve, in some ways I feel like that's digression, not progression. And we've all have a version of ourselves that if we looked back and went, oh, wow, that, I wish that I hadn't lived my life that way or thought that way. And so it becomes a real fine dance in speaking up for those who are marginalized, and at the same time holding space for someone, or holding space for ideas that maybe not everyone shares. And so somebody asked me one time, they said, how do you practically do that here at Watershed? And I said, well, it's not clean and simple. It's messy, but it's worth the pursuit. It's worth exploring and pioneering being a community that loves people, not because we all are the same and think the same, but because we all are not the same and we do things differently. That's an ongoing experiment and a maturation process that we're still trying to grab hold of here in community with one another.
Hey, it's Sharon. I'm finding that whatever the issue is that's going through the cycle, I'll hold on to it maybe a week or two, and then it'll just go back to the same cycle, like a bad habit.
Yeah, I wonder what would have happened to Elijah if he'd gone back in the cave. Maybe he needed more time in the cave. I don't know if this lives for you guys, but there were ways that I viewed myself relationally, especially early on in my adulthood. And it seemed like it was sort of the experience of seeing this movie before. Have you ever had that experience? Like, wait a minute, I've gone down this path before. I continue to activate my life the same way, and it continues to produce the same results. And I wish I had a real defined way of speaking into what you just said, other than I've been there and I know what that feels like, and that is so frustrating. What happened for me, my experience was, at some point, the return to that cycle became so painful, that's when it clicked. It's like, how many times do I have to hit the bottom before I realize there's something about me that I have to see differently so that I can live differently. So I would say that there's hope still, but maybe you're still stuck in one, or maybe you're still resting in a place within that cycle and it hasn't come full circle for you, but it will. Just keep, maybe that's the new faith language, believing that at some point this will create the change that I long for.
If you identify, if you know what's happening, I guess that's the healthy part of it.
Well,
that it's happening again, that, I'm going back to my old ways.
Absolutely. And part of why I feel like this is helpful for people, or why one of the reasons I hope it's helpful, is when we as a community started to embrace, this is a mapping of how things take place, literally in my life now at 52, when something starts to take place, in my mind I'm going, all right, I wonder what stage I'm in. Am I in the change stage? Am I in the suffering and death stage? Am I in the awareness stage? Do I really have a new idea? Probably not. And then being in it with, and again, we're going to talk about the progressive plane of community at some point, but having people around you that you can process with, and it's safe, and giving them permission to go, I still think there's more work to do here. You might need to go back to the cave. Or, why are you still standing here? Go. Now is the time to go. You are healed, or you are okay, or we believe you. Whatever it is that needs to be said, often within the context of community, there's an unleashing within this cycle that we get to experience with one another. I want to be mindful of your time this morning. This was fun. I had a lot of fun. Can I pray and just ask God to continue to push us forward here in the way that we have a transformation experience with one another. And God, this morning, it's so interesting to read a book that's 2,000 years old and see our lives unfold in the pages of something that maybe we thought was completely archaic. And so as we sit with one another, recognizing all that's changing in our lives and all the different parts of ourselves, the layers that yet have to be peeled back so that we can really see something new about ourselves, the world. Can we see you? Can we begin to have an experience with the divine image that we proclaim to be real, that exists in each and every one of us? And can we begin to see that in the other as well? God, we're on this crazy journey of exploration and discovery and newness. As things die for us, may we live. As our blindness falls away and we see, may we be who we need to be for each other and with each other, so that in this space, there's a world that gets created that might turn heads in the rest of the world to say, oh, wow, there's a hopeful, loving reality that's possible in Christ, in God, and in community. We love you. Amen.